Um, I want to start by expressing gratitude for the ability to be here. And thank you, Roshi, for inviting me to join you all in community. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate being back. With that said, there's going to be a bit of a plot twist for those of you who are in SEBT and receive the emails with, the talk title and the description. When I was touching base with Roshi, she informed me of all of the amazing um, astrological and meaningful things going on, which explains a lot in terms of where I am and what I've been experiencing. Um, but I, originally picked the title and topic for this talk maybe about a month ago. But out of respect for where I am now, and in the spirit of authenticity and integrity, there's been a slight change in order to ground what I'm saying with where I am and where I feel like a lot of us are as we are moving through these shifts and transitions and continuing the work of 2020 and before and after. As you know, or as you may know, we celebrate a blood moon today. And yesterday we experienced a full moon, which occurs when the moon simply orbits around the Earth about every 30 days. So I want to explore what it means for things to come full circle and what happens when things that are done in the dark are finally brought to the light. So when I looked up what a blood moon actually is in terms of science and how it occurs, essentially a blood moon happens when a full moon moves through the Earth's shadow. And, the sun still has contact with the moon's surface and is still reflecting light. And that's basically that red and orangish hue that we see reflected off of the moon, and we call it a blood moon. So in other words, blood moon is the effect of shadows or things, as I mentioned, that, are done in darkness, like the rotation of the moon. It comes into contact with light. And I sat with the symbolism of this and what that can mean for us as people who are witnessing this transformative moment and are in the midst of many transformative moments. What does it mean for, the shadows and the darkness of our subconscious and the things that we planted in our minds and the seeds that we have sown as a result through our action? What does it mean for those things to be brought to the light and finally come to fruition? So for me personally, recognizing the co-occurrence of the blood moon and aligning that with what I've been feeling, as I was struggling to stick with the original plan for this Dharma talk, and also just moving through transitions in my own life. And trying to really contextualize all of these emotions and these experiences from everything that we've all witnessed collectively and individually. And processing what does it mean right now to sow new dreams and to uproot old, harmful, and toxic patterns and ways of thinking. And even though I, am discussing a personal transformation to some degree, which for me has been unsettling and disruptive as transitions often are, I again recognize that my own experience is not decontextualized or removed from what's occurring in our culture, with all of us experiencing shifts where nations and societies are also being called to sow new dreams and uproot old and harmful patterns, whether that's white supremacy, American imperialism, classism, I mean, you name it, so on and so forth. So with that consideration, Of course, nations are made up of people and individuals. So of course, things that affect me and affect us personally have an effect on all of us. And I also think about this as someone who experiences systemic trauma and oppression, being a Black woman, being, queer myself, as someone who's also internalized a lot of that thinking because I'm American. I grew up in this society. So even being oppressed by certain systems, I'm still internalizing that and inflicting that harm myself because I'm not separate from the systems that have shaped me. And even so, that becomes more complex as I think about occupying land, the land of people who are actively being erased despite their very alive and real existence. So for me, I'm in Los Angeles, and that's the land of the Topa people.
Do you want to listen to that?
Whichever's easiest.
Well, I can hear this, but I can't hear.
Is someone unmuted?
It was somebody. I muted.
Got it. Thank you. So yeah, so this personal conversation and in context with this national conversation that has been ongoing, and is tied to what we're experiencing globally and what we're witnessing, for example, in Israel and Palestine. All of these things are very much tied to the practice. So these conflicts of sorts, and I say conflict, and I know I just spoke of very violent systems like white supremacy. I mentioned what's going on in Israel and Palestine. I want to be clear on the difference between conflict and violence. They are two totally different things, although when we as people are often called to engage conflict, it's not uncommon to employ violent methods in order to avoid the transformation and discomfort and the lack of predictability and control that comes with the transformative process of conflict. But that said, as we're being called to sow these new dreams and uproot these old and harmful patterns, I want to be very attentive to our relationship to grief and impermanence in this process. So I mentioned grief, I mentioned impermanence, and what I mean by that is, the practice calls us to not only be aware of, but to lean into our relationship with impermanence. Our relationship with impermanence, when not brought to our awareness, and when allowed to just sit there in the subconscious and those dark alleys of our mind, can frequently drive our action instead of inform it. And when we operate subconsciously without guidance and attention of what's going on for us, all of the things that we've kept in the dark, our fears and anxieties and our resistance, those fears and those things that we subconsciously push down, of course, have consequences that reflect the very darkness that it hides. So an example of that would be someone who is subconsciously afraid of losing their power out of fear of feeling powerlessness. And that fear of powerlessness is directly tied to a fear of impermanence. Folks who fear, probably most of us, who fear powerlessness, fear vulnerability. They equate vulnerability with weakness. They equate weakness with failure. They equate failure with death. And death, of course, death with a small d and death with a big D, both of those are intimately connected to impermanence. And whenever there's something that we fear, especially if we aren't intimately aware of that fear, there's something to protect. And the subconscious mind and our actions will go through extraordinary lengths to protect whatever it is we feel called to protect if we aren't aware. So when we aren't aware of what's happening for us subconsciously, and if we aren't aware of our relationship to impermanence and the grief that's related to it, then we, despite our best intentions, even those of us who are invested in a socially engaged Buddhist practice, will inflict harmful dynamics against others in order to avoid actualizing the very things that we fear. And I'll go into more examples of that, as I talk, but generally, I feel that we are all guilty of this when we aren't aware of how fear of loss and fear of impermanence is operating in our life. And whether or not it's intentional or not intentional, the consequences of that harm and the trauma that we inflict remains the same for the people that we're coming into contact with, and especially for the people that we are serving in a socially engaged Buddhist context, whether that's as a hospice or palliative care chaplain, as someone working in a hospital, a social worker, a therapist, community organizer, artist, whoever it might be. All of these dynamics remain relevant because we are constantly in community with people, which means that we are constantly, encountering these dynamics. So this fear that I'm describing, this fear of the reality of impermanence and fear of loss and everything that stems from it, and the lack of awareness of it, and the grief associated with it, again, can cause us to enact harmful dynamics on a larger scale when this is the culture that we live in, and the culture breeds this lack of awareness. And what this can look like on a smaller scale, it can look like, of course, harming those who come into intimate contact with us, whether it's a person that we're dating and they try to open up to us and we are defensive out of fear of being vulnerable, or whether we are crossing someone's boundaries because we view boundaries as rejection as opposed to an attempt to stay in connection and community with someone. Or on a larger scale, on a societal scale, where we are looking at racial and ethnic violence and genocide. These are all seeds that have grown long ago, since the beginning of human existence, as people have sought ways to subvert power, avoid conflict, and essentially avoid their relationship to impermanence and the grief that stems from it, in an attempt to buy themselves more comfort and more time, right? I've used the term grief a couple of times. I've also used the term impermanence, and I haven't explained that because I know that most of us are familiar with the practice and know what impermanence is, but I want to go into more detail about how I'm using and defining grief specifically as it relates to impermanence. Because typically when I talk about grief, people's minds go to concrete and past loss, things that have happened in the past, have already occurred, but have no bearing on the present aside from our memory and our attachment to that memory. And this could be anything from, death of a dog as a child, the loss of a grandparent, divorce of parents, moving from your hometown, whatever it might be. Typically, when people think of grief, they're thinking about, things that have already occurred. But as we explore grief in relationship to the reality of impermanence, a reality that, as I mentioned, has been around since the beginning of human existence, and is ever consistent, ever present, which means that, it's past, present, and future. I invite each of us to look at grief as something that's bigger than what's already happened to us, something that's bigger than past and concrete loss, and to understand grief contextually as something that is very much connected to the present and very much connected to the future, as something that is tied to impermanence, which we are experiencing from moment to moment. And therefore, if grief is connected to the present and it's connected to the future, it's also intimately tied to the things that we fear, to the things that we love, to who and what we aspire to become. So making this shift in understanding grief has direct consequences on our ability to not only affect daily change in our personal lives, but to also affect larger social and political change, starting with the communities that we're serving and where we are on a day-to-day basis. Because what each of us are called to do as socially engaged Buddhists is to engage our own relationship to impermanence and to suffering, and the grief associated with it, and then use that transformation as a resource to support our work in transforming others and transforming systems. If systems are made up of people, then if we use our own practice and the transformation that stems from that to assist in transforming others, then we inevitably transform these larger systems, regardless of how long it takes. And I know many of us are familiar with the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path. And if you haven't noticed a theme, essentially the Four Noble Truths have a lot to say about suffering, right? So we all suffer. It is driven that home very clearly. And one of the primary causes of suffering is desire. And that includes our desire to change the reality of suffering itself, which ironically kind of enhances suffering. I don't know, Buddhism, what can I say? So going back to the first noble truth, specifically on the reality of suffering, another major cause of suffering, in addition to desire, is our relationship to impermanence. We again know that life is impermanent, and the idea that things are constantly changing and shifting, and our desire and recognizing our desire to change that reality, also has a lot to say about our relationship to suffering and how we enhance our suffering in some ways that are necessary. But the key here is that whenever we are discussing impermanence, we are inherently discussing loss, right? And whenever we are discussing loss, we are inherently discussing grief. More often than not, with a lot of the folks I work with, grief really gets a bad rep, especially when working one-on-one with clients. When I'm working with hospice and hospital patients, there still is some grief avoidance, but it's the presence and the reality of grief is much more palpable. That having certain conversations is certainly easier than having conversations around grief with someone who isn't forced by external circumstances to explore something that they otherwise find is uncomfortable to delve into. And I find that, a consistent misconception for people who aren't familiar with impermanence and what that means and aren't familiar with the practice is that they feel that grief automatically has a negative connotation. So, again, they tie it to past loss, concrete loss, something that they don't want to think about. Or they tie it to an unwanted transition, like something that they didn't consensually give up or didn't want to lose. And therefore, for a lot of these folks, grief is connected to sadness. But if impermanence is embedded in our experience as human beings from day one, then we are constantly in a state of transition and flux, which means, and yet we notice that we don't constantly feel sad, right? Which must mean that grief is more complex than we initially give it credit for. And I think this really boils down to, what I was saying earlier. I gave conflict as an example and the extent to which people try to control circumstances out of, fear of feeling that sense of powerlessness and lack of control. associated with impermanence and not wanting to let things go. So that grasping and that grasping mind can really just perpetuate all sorts of toxic dynamics. But typically when people think of grief, and if they're thinking of it in the context of sadness, they think of lack of control, and then they likely, from my experience of working with folks one-on-one, don't recognize the presence of grief in circumstances where they are under the illusion of control, because again, we are all experiencing impermanence moment to moment. So an example would be someone who is welcoming a career shift that they were actually looking forward to and something that they initiated themselves, right? And, if it is self-initiated and they are excited about it, maybe they're excited about the title change or the change in pay or going to a new location, whatever it might be, that transition and the impermanence that comes with it feels positive for the most part. And even so, even in that quote unquote positive transition, there's often a sense of underlying sadness that comes with, the feeling of loss, whether it's having to learn a new path to work, learn new systems, meet new people, say goodbye to people that those folks knew and appreciated. There's still grief within that moment or within those positive moments that often aren't noticed if the change feels welcome, and if it feels like there's some sort of agency and consent in bringing about that change. When we numb ourselves to the reality of impermanence on a day-to-day basis, and only notice those major transitions like death at the end of life, or only notice grief when it's essentially hitting us across the head like 2020 with a bunch of unexpected transitions that weren't necessarily welcome, but life happened as it does. And here we are being called to move through the suffering and move through this grief, whether, we want to be pulled along with it or not. We can become numb to grief in both beautiful moments and subtle moments in which it is functioning, especially in relationships and within power dynamics. So in other words, by cutting ourselves off from that awareness that we, are practicing to cultivate through our practice, we cut ourselves off from so many possibilities and opportunities for connection. And when we cut ourselves off from possibilities and opportunities for connection, that breeds disconnection, that breeds, systems that disconnect people from themselves and from each other. And we ultimately weaken the possibility for impermanence to transform us, and therefore to allow us to transform the situations that we enter into, simply because we either ignore it and don't know that it's there, or it's there and working in toxic ways that don't bring about the transformation, the positive transformation that we ultimately hope to enact as socially engaged Buddhists. So I want to clarify and say that there's a difference between the type of grief brought about from past experiences, which is typically what people talk about when they think of grief, and grief tied to the present and the future. So when I'm talking about grief related to the present and the future, with impermanence being present now and a part of the future, I typically call that fear of loss. And fear of loss is a type of grief that most of us are probably aware of. But in speaking of grief, or even the grief we're experiencing now and the grief that we experienced within 2020, the importance of addressing fear of loss as it relates to impermanence often is put on the back burner to address the suffering that has transpired from what is already happening. Right. So a lot of us, a lot of people and organizations have a really reactionary response to grief and actions, as opposed to being attentive to the present moment in order to discontinue the perpetuation of further harm and further violence. So the reality of impermanence essentially tells us that everything that we have right now, everything and everyone that we have come to love and we come to appreciate, we will ultimately lose those things, right? And we are born into this reality by virtue of the fact that we are mortal and we are given a life that we will ultimately lose. And even for people who aren't invested in this practice and haven't thought about this on a conscious level, there's still that subconscious awareness of the reality of impermanence and what that means on a day-to-day basis. Because it can't not be, right? Even if it's something that, especially a lot of younger folks that I work with in their 20s and 30s who aren't necessarily facing death or dying, but are maybe having trouble in their relationships. And they don't necessarily connect, their power issues or their control issues with their partner, whoever it might be, with their relationship to fear of loss and impermanence, because, impermanence and grief and death, those are things that you think about at the end of your life. And 20-something, what does that have to do with being 20-something, right? But it has to do with everything. It's an awareness that we are constantly carrying with us, though certain circumstances and being at certain points in our life simply just makes us aware of what has already been there. Like a pandemic, it makes people much more aware of what has already been here, including the reality of impermanence and grief, including white supremacy and its downstream stream effects on communities of color, including classism and not raising the minimum wage. All of these things that have simply been there, but it takes certain circumstances for what's already existed to be brought to our attention and brought to the light. Now, I mentioned white supremacy and I mentioned racism, and I talked about things that are done subconsciously or seeds that have been sown previously and uprooting those toxic and harmful dynamics. Typically, when I talk about racism or grief as it relates to racism, people specifically think about the grief experienced by people who are suffering under the foot of white supremacy. And the same with sexism, the same with classism, the same with all of these systems. Like our minds go to the people who are directly suffering from these various systems. But in thinking about fear of loss and the importance of each of us as socially engaged Buddhists who are going into situations where we are serving suffering and vulnerable populations, it is equally important for each of us to be attentive to our own relationship to grief and fear of loss based on our privilege, right? An example of this would be, I was talking to a friend not too long ago, maybe a couple months ago, and she was telling me about how her CEO gave a talk, which he gives yearly, to the company. And this company has certain metrics that they make public every year around the number of women they're going to hire, the number of people of color they're going to hire, the number of marginalized people in different leadership positions and different departments. So they publish these goals and these metrics. And at the beginning of each year, they meet with the company or everyone in the company, whoever wants to join, and they discuss the previous year's metrics, and then they set goals for the upcoming year. And after the CEO, gave those numbers, and after 2020, they became more aggressive with ensuring that they met those goals. He opened up Q&A to the audience for feedback and to answer their questions. And my friend shared how surprised she was at the number of white people who walked up and asked if hiring more Black people or having certain diversity initiatives would mean that there would be less white people hired for positions. And the same thing with men. Like if you're hiring more women for these positions, and does that mean that there will be less men who get to have these positions, right? And that didn't sit right with my friend. And the CEO responded with a very placating response and assured people that that is not what that meant. And I really sat with this and the consequences of him giving that response and the consequence of him being grief avoidant and him not honoring the importance of tackling, the reality of impermanence as it relates to privilege and as it relates to, having people with a privileged identity in a given situation really come to terms with their relationship to grief and impermanence in order to solve these systemic issues instead of being reactive, as I mentioned earlier, and simply responding after the harm has been done, right? And my first thought was, we have got to stop lying to people, And my second thought was, of course, that means that there will be less white people who are hired for these positions or less men who are hired for these positions. If these goals are set with the acknowledgement that privilege exists, which sets an imbalance where people based on their race and their gender or what have you experience more opportunities by virtue of their identity. And if we're saying that we want to balance those scales, then that means that people who are used to getting more and don't know what it's like to feel less will start to feel that they are getting less because we are creating balance. Like if there are a finite number of roles in this company, and right now, if 80% of management positions are occupied by men or by white folks, and if we're saying that we want 50% to be women or 50% to be Black people and people of color, then yeah, that does mean that there will be loss. It means that when Breeshia and Sherelle and DeMarcus and Shanita, whoever applies for a job with our resume, that we have an equal shot at the same position as someone with a name like Hannah or Chad or Sarah or a Eurocentric name, right? It means that we are all competing equally for the same opportunities, and we are creating a system of equity where one group of people or groups of people aren't suffering under the foot of a certain type of injustice. Right, racism or sexism, whatever it might be. And there's loss that comes with that. And there's loss that must be brought to the attention of people who have privilege in a given area if we are actually going to make headway. If tackling systemic oppression is more than just a conversation of theory. So, in the situation with jobs, if we are competing equally for a finite number of jobs, and if we are saying that we are balancing the systems of oppression, okay, so if you're used to having a certain number of jobs and options available to you, and now things are not as readily available, then that impacts your income, and that impacts your access to healthcare. And that impacts your family's access to healthcare, your children, your wife, or your spouse. That impacts where you can live. That impacts your child's access to certain school systems, which impacts their future. Like these are all things that are pushed on to marginalized people that we move through and navigate through on a daily basis. And it wreaks havoc on our lives long term. But if we are talking about, creating systems of equity, then there will be loss in the transition of, shifting from a system that is favoring white people within white supremacy or men within patriarchy. So honoring the importance of impermanence and recognizing the way that it is functioning in our day-to-day lives and being intimately aware of our relationship to grief and impermanence, not just as it relates to things that have already occurred, but as it relates to the things that we want to transpire to our present moment and the future that we actually want to actualize in doing this work is exceedingly important for each of us, exceedingly important for each of us to attend to for ourselves, not just in theory. And as socially engaged Buddhists, we have a practice that comes with tools that help us move through these transitions, whether it's a practice in sitting itself or the Eightfold Path. We are given tools that call us to transform our own suffering so that we can do this work effectively. So a lot of religious traditions have a lot to say about the blood moon and its meaning. For myself, I grew up Christian, Southern Baptist to be exact. And in Joel, the idea of the blood moon is that it represents the end of times. And in a way, that's accurate, except the end of times isn't always negative and doom, which feels awkward to say in the middle of a pandemic. But when we're calling or talking about the end of times as it relates to the end of the reign of white supremacy and American imperialism and of classism and these various forms of systemic oppression, this is a painful moment that each of us are moving through. And we are really being called to be attentive to what that means and what we're carrying. So we're at a place in our nation's history in particular where things that have been done in the dark have just taken off and have grown unchecked for centuries. The seeds of ignorance, the seeds of hatred, the seeds of delusion and avoidance have all come full circle. And we are seeing what it means for those things to be moved out of the darkness and into our awareness very intimately. And much like the moon orbiting around the earth, these things have come full circle, and we are being invited to come full circle with it, to align ourselves and to make a commitment to ourselves and to the people that we serve. So in conclusion, impermanence is not merely about what we are being asked to let go. And it's not merely about things that have already transpired in the past. Impermanence also asks us to look at what we are called to embrace for the future. Thank you.